Act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism evaluates the morality of an individual action based on its consequences, whether it maximizes overall happiness. In contrast, rule utilitarianism evaluates the morality of actions based on whether they conform to rules that, if universally followed, would maximize overall happiness.
Theseus's ship. Theseus's ship is a thought experiment that explores questions of identity and change over time. It asks whether a ship that has had all of its original parts replaced is still the same ship. This relates to philosophical debates about personal identity and whether something can be the same over time despite undergoing changes.
Should a leader be moral? This is a question about the relationship between morality and political leadership. It asks whether a leader should prioritize moral principles and the greater good, or whether they should be willing to act immorally if it serves their political interests or the interests of the state. Utilitarians would likely argue that a leader should act morally if that maximizes overall well-being.
Fatalism. Fatalism is the belief that all events are predetermined and inevitable, and that humans have no control over their future. This conflicts with the utilitarian belief that our actions can have meaningful consequences and that we should strive to make the world better.
Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is an argument that it is in one's best interest to believe in God, because if God exists, belief will lead to infinite rewards in the afterlife, whereas if God does not exist, there is little lost by believing. Utilitarians would likely reject this as an inadequate basis for belief, as it does not consider the consequences of belief itself.
Nurture versus nature. This refers to the long-standing debate in psychology and philosophy about the relative influences of innate, biological factors, nature, versus environmental and experiential factors, nurture, on human development and behavior. Utilitarians would be interested in understanding these influences in order to maximize well-being.
Antinatalism versus pronatalism. Antinatalism is the view that it is morally wrong to bring new sentient beings into existence, while pronatalism supports reproduction and the creation of new lives. Utilitarians would evaluate these views based on their consequences for overall well-being.
Essentialism. Essentialism is the view that things have an unchanging essential nature or essence that defines what they are. This contrasts with the utilitarian focus on consequences rather than inherent properties.
Qualia. Qualia refers to the subjective, first-person conscious experiences of individuals. Utilitarians are concerned with maximizing the positive qualia, happiness, pleasure, and minimizing the negative qualia, suffering, pain, of all sentient beings.
Rationalism versus empiricism. Rationalism holds that knowledge comes primarily from reason and a priori principles, while empiricism holds that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience.
Altruism. Altruism is the principle or practice of concern for the welfare of others. This aligns with utilitarianism's focus on maximizing the well-being of all sentient beings, not just oneself.
Hedonism. Hedonism is the view that pleasure is the highest good and the proper aim of human life.
Objectivism. Objectivism is the view that there are objective moral truths that exist independently of what any individual or group believes.
Solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical view that only one's own mind is certain to exist, and that the external world and other minds cannot be known and may not exist outside the individual's own mind. This radical form of skepticism challenges the assumption that we can have knowledge of anything beyond our own subjective experiences.
Consequentialism. Consequentialism is the moral theory that the consequences of one's actions are the ultimate basis for any judgment about the morality of those actions. In other words, consequentialists believe that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends entirely on the outcomes it produces, rather than on the nature of the action itself or the motives behind it.
Deontology. Deontology is the moral theory that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the action's adherence to a rule or rules, rather than on the consequences of the action. Deontologists argue that there are certain absolute moral duties and principles, such as do not lie, that must be upheld regardless of the outcomes. This contrasts with consequentialist approaches that judge the morality of an action based solely on its results.
Omnipotence. Omnipotence refers to the quality of having unlimited or very great power. In theology, the concept of omnipotence is often used to describe the attributes of God, who is believed to have the ability to do anything that is logically possible. The idea of omnipotence raises philosophical questions about the nature of God's power and whether it is truly limitless or constrained in some way.
Paradoxes. Paradoxes are statements or problems that, despite apparently sound reasoning from true premises, lead to logically contradictory or absurd conclusions. Paradoxes challenge our assumptions about logic and rationality and have been the subject of much philosophical debate and analysis. They can arise in various domains, including logic, ethics, and metaphysics.
Parable of the Invisible Gardener. The parable of the invisible gardener is a thought experiment that illustrates the difficulty of proving or disproving the existence of God. The parable imagines a situation where two people debate the existence of an invisible gardener who tends to a garden. Despite extensive efforts to detect the gardener's presence, neither person can conclusively prove or disprove the gardener's existence, leading to the question of how one can rationally justify beliefs about the supernatural.
Allegory of the Cave. The allegory of the cave is a famous analogy from Plato's Republic that describes humans as prisoners in a cave, only able to perceive shadows on a wall rather than reality. This allegory is used to illustrate the concept of the difference between appearance and reality and the difficulty of escaping the limitations of one's own perspective to perceive the true nature of the world.
Consciousness. Consciousness refers to the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings. It is a central problem in philosophy of mind, as philosophers grapple with questions about the nature of subjective experience, the relationship between the mind and the brain, and the possibility of artificial consciousness. The nature of consciousness remains one of the most challenging and intriguing areas of philosophical inquiry.
Moral relativism versus absolutism. Moral relativism is the view that moral truths are relative to a particular culture or individual, rather than being universal. In contrast, moral absolutism holds that there are objective, universal moral truths that apply regardless of individual or cultural beliefs. The debate between relativism and absolutism raises fundamental questions about the foundations of morality and the possibility of moral knowledge.
Reductionism versus holism. Reductionism is the view that complex phenomena can be explained by reducing them to their fundamental parts or components. In contrast, holism is the view that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that complex systems cannot be fully understood by simply analyzing their individual components. This philosophical debate has implications for how we approach the study of various phenomena, from the natural sciences to the social sciences and beyond.
Noumenon. The noumenon refers to a thing as it is in itself, independent of any effects on the senses, as opposed to a phenomenon, which is how the thing appears to the senses. This distinction, introduced by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, highlights the difference between the thing in itself and the way it is perceived and experienced by the human mind. The noumenon represents the underlying reality that may be inaccessible to our direct observation and understanding.
Propositional calculus. Propositional calculus is a branch of mathematical logic that deals with the relationships between propositions, which are statements that can be either true or false. This formal system of logic provides a framework for analyzing the logical structure of arguments and reasoning, and has applications in various fields, including computer science, philosophy, and mathematics.
Absurdism. Absurdism is the philosophical view that the search for meaning is inherently in conflict with the human need to find meaning. Absurdists argue that the universe is fundamentally devoid of meaning or purpose, and that the human condition is characterized by a fundamental tension between our desire for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of existence. This perspective has influenced various artistic and literary movements, as well as philosophical approaches to the human condition.
Determinism. Determinism is the view that all events, including human actions and choices, are determined by prior events combined with the laws of nature. This philosophical position challenges the notion of free will and raises questions about the extent to which we can be held morally responsible for our actions if they are ultimately the result of causal factors beyond our control.
Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical view that life has no meaning or purpose and rejects all religious, moral, and social principles and values. Nihilists believe that existence is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value, and that all efforts to find or create meaning are ultimately futile. This radical perspective has had a significant influence on various artistic, literary, and philosophical movements.
Stoicism. Stoicism is a philosophy that emphasizes virtue, wisdom, and self-control as the path to a good and meaningful life. Stoics believe that individuals should focus on what is within their control, such as their own thoughts and actions, and accept with equanimity what is outside their control. This approach to life has been influential in both ancient and modern philosophy, and has been associated with the development of resilience and emotional well-being.
Existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy that emphasizes individual existence, freedom, and choice as the foundation of meaning. Existentialists argue that individuals are responsible for creating their own essence and meaning through the choices they make and the actions they take. This perspective has had a significant impact on various artistic, literary, and philosophical movements, and has influenced discussions about the nature of human identity, freedom, and the search for meaning.